Welcome back, scholars, to our Digital Academy. I am Professor Spark. Whether we are turning the pages of a timeless novel, our mission remains the same. Will today's sweep us into the concert hall? Let's find out together.
Okay, when we think of 19th century classical music, I bet you probably picture, rigid formalities and very polite, restrained art, right? But let's dive into this explainer by looking at a piece of music from 1830 that completely shattered that boring stereotype. We're talking about Hector Berlioz's Symphony Fantastique. This was a totally groundbreaking programmatic symphony that didn't just push boundaries, it absolutely bulldozed them. It expanded the symphony into this vivid, incredibly visceral form of musical storytelling. Now, what's really interesting here is how the legendary conductor Leonard Bernstein described this. He set the stage perfectly by calling the symphony an early expedition into psychedelia. And honestly, when you look at the sheer theatricality of what Berlioz actually composed, that description is spot on. This isn't just some collection of pretty melodies, it's a full-on exploration of altered consciousness. He used the orchestra to map out some extremely dark and chaotic corners of the human mind, literally decades before modern psychology even existed. So this brings us to a rather wild question. What exactly happens when unrequited love meets an opium overdose? That is the shocking 1830 premise of Berlioz's masterpiece. It's essentially a semi-autobiographical psychological thriller about a young, desperate artist. This protagonist, who is pretty much a stand-in for Berlioz himself, is thrown into such a massive fit of despair over a love he just can't have that he poisons himself with opium. But instead of dying, he plunges into a series of vivid, terrifying hallucinations. Section 4. The Anatomy of Obsession. The Artist in Harriet Smithson. To really wrap our heads around this, we have to look at the real-life inspiration. In 1827, Berlioz saw a performance by an English theater troupe and fell incredibly, obsessively in love with an Irish actress named Harriet Smithson. Well, she initially rejected him, which drove him into a state of deep emotional derangement. And he poured all that raw agony directly into this brilliant musical device called the idée fixe. It acts as the auditory representation of pure obsession. It stalks the protagonist throughout the entire piece. Think of it kind of like a musical stalker. It's this long, yearning melody representing Harriet, and it returns obsessively in every single movement. But here's the absolute genius part. As the artist's mental state deteriorates, the melody actually distorts. It changes its guise depending on the context of the hallucination, philosophically showing monomania, or obsessive love, as both an exalted and a highly destructive force. Let's move to Section 6, a 5-part hallucination, the descent into madness. Usually, symphonies had 4 movements, right? But Berlioz expanded his into 5, giving himself the perfect, sprawling canvas to map out this visceral, hallucinatory descent. Each step represents a distinct emotional state and a brand new chapter in this opium dream. We're going from longing to fleeting joy, over to anxiety, then sheer terror, and finally, outright demonic madness. Let's break down how the music actually paints this picture. Starting off with a slow, dreamy pace, the first movement conveys the vagueness of passions. It bounces between a dreamy adagio and a passionate allegro, really capturing those sudden emotional storms of a love-struck mind. Then, in the second movement, we are swept up into this glittering waltz. The artist imagines himself at a vibrant social gathering, and boom, the idée fixe appears right in the middle of this swirling dance. It perfectly evokes that feeling of fleeting joy, hopelessly mixed with a deep, isolating longing. You're in a crowded room, but you feel totally alone. The tension really starts to build in the third movement, the scene in the fields. Initially, it's this peaceful rural scene. Berlioz creates a calming, pastoral duet between 2 woodwind instruments, suggesting a tranquil dialogue. But, as you might guess, the piece absolutely does not last. This serenity is suddenly shattered by the sound of distant thunder, introducing a creeping anxiety. It's the ultimate musical cue that this dream is about to turn very, very dark. Ramping up the intensity big time, the hallucinating artist in the 4th movement imagines that he has actually murdered his beloved. His punishment? The march to the scaffold. It is this relentless, militaristic march that builds and builds to a horrifyingly triumphant climax. And right at the very end, we hear a brief, desperate recollection of the idée fixe melody, his final thought of her. And then, it's brutally cut short by a dramatic pizzicato, a violent pluck of the strings, and a massive chord that perfectly mimics the swift, gruesome drop of the guillotine. But get this, death isn't even the end of the hallucination. The final plunge into madness is the witch's Sabbath. The artist finds himself at his own funeral, and he's surrounded by monsters. That beautiful Ide Fix melody we heard earlier, it is now totally degraded and grotesque. The movement features tolling bells and a satanic, mocking parody of the sacred Dies Irae chant. It's just this wild round dance of demonic ecstasy, completely pushing the listener into pure Gothic horror. Which brings us to Section 12, Breaking the Classical Rules, the Spirit of Revolution. Zooming out from the narrative for a second, it's vital to understand that Berlioz wasn't just writing a scary story here. He was completely upending the artistic establishment of his day. You see, the older classical era was all about strict forms, logic, and order. But Berlioz, heavily influenced by Beethoven, Shakespeare, and Goethe's Faust, championed the core philosophies of Romanticism. He argued for the primacy of individual emotion and imagination. He essentially created the trope of the tortured genius, turning away from logic and diving headfirst into the irrational, the sublime, and the boundless chaos of the subconscious mind. And the timing of this? Definitely no coincidence. He made Smithson in 1827, and by 1830, the exact same year this symphony premieres, France experiences the July Revolution. Composed right on the heels of this massive political upheaval, the symphony literally physically captures the era's revolutionary spirit. Just as the public was challenging and overthrowing old political regimes, Berlioz was overthrowing the old musical regimes. He was loudly asserting that demonic, grotesque, and deeply personal themes were perfectly valid artistic territory. Oh, and for the record, he actually did eventually marry Smithson in 1833. Though, given the absolute intensity we've just seen, you can probably imagine that was quite a complex relationship. Now, to pull off this massive auditory ambition, Berlioz demanded a bizarre, colossal orchestra. He used techniques that turned the instruments into vehicles for inner psychological states. Reflecting the expanded resources of the Industrial Revolution, he used massive dynamic contrasts and completely unprecedented sounds. I mean, he brought in harps, the cor anglais, heavy church bells, and even an obsolete brass instrument called the ophicleide. He literally instructed the string section to play col ligno, which means hitting the strings with the wood of the bow to mimic the rattling bones of skeletons in the finale. It is just wild stuff. So, by actually distributing program notes at his performances, Berlioz made his narrative intent totally explicit. He cemented Symphonie Fantastique as a cornerstone of programmatic storytelling. He didn't want the audience guessing what the music meant. He practically handed them the literal script of his opium dream. This direct communication of a narrative through symphonic music was a huge deal, completely paving the way for future musical innovators like Liszt and Wagner to build their own massive musical dramas. Look, talking about this music is one thing, but to truly experience this madness, the incredible dynamic shifts, and the sheer dramatic intensity for yourself, you absolutely have to listen to it. I highly, highly recommend seeking out the full performance conducted by Myung-Won Chung with the Orchestre Philharmonique de Radio France. It is a brilliant, highly regarded interpretation that perfectly captures all the terrifying, visceral power that Berlioz intended. As we wrap up this explainer, think about this. Berlioz took his darkest obsessions and transformed them into a revolutionary work of art that forever changed music. It really makes you wonder about the art we consume today, doesn't it? Ask yourself, how do the modern creators you love channel their own obsessions and internal chaos into their work? And the next time you experience a piece of media that boldly explores the dark, chaotic landscapes of the human mind, see if you can trace just a little bit of that courage all the way back to 1830, to Hector Berlioz's incredible opium dream.